Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with Dame Evelyn Glennie, and I Am Remarkable. For those of you who aren't familiar with I Am Remarkable, it's a global movement that empowers everyone to celebrate their achievements in the workplace. And to date, about 400,000 people have attended the workshop across 170 countries and over 1,000 companies. Today, we're here to celebrate the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which was officially on December 3rd, and we're here to shine a light on disabled and neurodivergent individuals and their experiences, so we can practice all being more aware and better allies every day. For those of you who would like to use captions, there's a link in the live chat that will take you to live captions that are being produced by our captioner. My name is Vince Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, sometimes known as one of the co-inventors of the Internet. Turns out I'm hearing impaired. I wear 2 hearing aids. I've been wearing them since I was about 13 years old, and I function more or less in the hearing environment. But I care a great deal about people with disabilities and their ability to work in the real world with others. And the whole point behind I Am Remarkable is to empower and enable people with disabilities to function to the best of their ability in the world with all the others. So to give you an overview of the session, first we're going to hear from Evelyn and her experience in life and music. And we'll learn a bit more about what makes her remarkable. Then we'll have some time for some live Q&A at the end, so share your questions and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So welcome, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Without further ado, we're so happy to have you with us today. Let me give you a little intro about your background. You're the world's premier solo percussionist, performing worldwide with great orchestras and artists. You're a double Grammy Award winner and a BAFTA nominee. You have composed for film, theater, and television. You began the Evelyn Glennie podcast in 2020, just recently, which is kind of cool. You were awarded an OBE in 1993, which does not mean overtaken by events. It means Order of the British Empire, which is always something fascinating to Americans. You've also gotten the Polar Music Prize and the Companion Honor and 100 other international awards, which we don't have time to go through at this moment. You're the curator for the Evelyn Glennie collection. Your iconic film, Touch the Sound, a TED Talk, and a book, Listen World, they all embody your mission to teach the world to listen, which is kind of cool for a person who's deaf. Most recently, as of last week, you were named the 2023 Sontag Music Prize recipient. Now, this is a big deal. And you said the prize reflects real celebration and inclusiveness, and indeed it does. You're profoundly deaf, just like I am, and your significance transcends the discipline of music because you've driven progress and innovation in a wide array of contexts on a global scale. So I'm so happy to have you on the show as part of the I Am Remarkable enterprise. So let's just get to a few questions, Evelyn. First of all, we've heard a bit about you from me, but we'd much rather hear it from you. You've achieved so much in your lifetime. Can you take us back in time and share with us some of the journey that brought you to where you are now?
Well, very much. Thank you for having me. And really, the pleasure is all mine. I've just been dying for this moment to meet you and to have this opportunity to chat. So thank you for that. Yes, I mean, I think my whole journey has been about listening. And thankfully, I went to schools whereby they believe that every child has a story to tell. And that goes a long way, because when you are trying to squeeze and tease out that story from an individual. That's all about listening. So it's not listening to a sound necessarily, it's listening literally to the presence of that person. And I was extremely lucky to be surrounded by staff members, you know, at school, and fellow pupils and so on, who all believed that they belonged to all departments of that school. And so therefore your eye is completely like this, you know, it's firing in all directions. And I think what's important with the education I had was really, you know, all of the or finding as many links between the subjects as possible. So when we think of music, you know, we think of, well, you practice and practice and practice for hours, and then you go and perform something. Well, that's only one part of what you do. So, and I remember my very, very, very first percussion lesson, and my teacher gave me, well, he didn't give it to me, but he said, take this drum away for 1 week. And there were no sticks and no stands. It was literally the drum. And I didn't know anything about this drum. And, you know, what am I to do with this? And in a way, this is the best possible position you can be in, because there are no rules. There's you don't know where those boundaries are, and all sorts of things. So you're bringing this object to your body rather than forcing the body into the object. And so there was this sort of freedom of just, first of all, looking at it, you know, and thinking, right, well, what am I going to do with you, you know, and how are you going to speak to me? And then I discovered that as I sort of tapped it and beat it and thumped it and tickled it and scraped it and did all sorts of things, it seemed to speak quite differently depending on where the drum was put. So if it was put on a wooden kitchen table, or on the settee, or on the garden lawn, or on a piece of concrete, whatever, it would just resonate quite differently. That was interesting to me, because that really fed into my sense of touch.
Mm-hmm.
And dynamics became something that were full of color, as opposed to just loud and soft, you know, up or down. Suddenly the color might have been thick or thin or distant or present, or, you know, fat or bulgy or really fragile, or whatever it might be. So you were adding all of these things. And I remember my second lesson, my teacher said to me, Evelyn, please create the feel of a tractor. Now, when you say the feel of a tractor, suddenly you have a whole orchestra of tractors in your mind. So is it a stationary tractor with the engine off, in which case...
Right.
There is no sound, but there's the presence of the tractor. Or is it an old rickety tractor, or a velvety new sounding tractor, or a tractor where you're in the cab of that tractor? Or is there no cab and you're just experiencing the elements? You know, so suddenly you have all of these things, the acoustics around you and things like that. And I think that those early lessons played a huge part in my journey as I was beginning to commission pieces for percussion in order to create the career of a full-time solo percussionist. And I needed to sustain the career. So there's no point in just commissioning one or two pieces. You had to commission many, many pieces to sustain that career. But that meant that you couldn't go and buy recordings of these. They were no use to me anyway. So you had to depend on the faith of yourself as a musician, and always bring that piece to the body, and manipulate that body with just basically what you felt at the time. So even if you play a piece of music 100 times, you're always starting from that clean sheet with it, and you're not trying to remember what you did before. So that was interesting. So really, I think that the journey has been a very personal journey in many respects, but it's also been a journey of bringing the audience with the repertoire, bringing the audience with the instruments. It hasn't been about, you must like this piece, you know, because it's a contemporary piece of music. You know, I've had to learn, you know, and get to know that piece in the same way that an audience have. It's just that I have it, you know, several weeks or months longer than the audience member. So the growing with the audience has been really important. So in a way, every single piece is like a world premiere. So even if you play a piece of Vivaldi on vibraphone, it's like a world premiere. You have a different audience there, a different acoustic, a different hall, you're wearing different clothes, it's a different day. And so it's that I find interesting, this kind of curiosity as to you know, what layers you can peel, you know, from the situation that you're in.
So what I find interesting, Evelyn, is your vocabulary describing what you've been doing, because you use terms like color and shape and, you know, heaviness or thickness and so on. These are almost synesthetic in the sense of synthesizing a variety of senses into sound. And so the idea of color and sound are very interesting combination of things. Look, I'd like to explore a bit more about how you make music. You're a solo percussionist, and we know that you have some interesting ways of listening. And you've even been known to play with your shoes, without your shoes on. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this process of listening with your body, apparently?
Well, basically, when I was playing percussion at school, so really from the age of 12, 13, I was wearing hearing aids. And of course, the hearing aids were not as advanced as they are now. And the hearing aids really boosted the sound, but they didn't give you the clarity. So it was quite difficult to determine the texture of things. It was just more like this wall of sound. And that it really can be very confusing, and that can really, you know, affect your balance and certainly your sense of touch. So all the sensitivity that a musician has when they're really struggling to hear something and make sense of something, even if it's too much noise, is very exhausting, but it affects so many other things physically as well. So I found that my sense of touch was the first thing that really was affected, but I knew inside of myself that I was actually quite a sensitive musician. You know, I understood, you know, about how to manipulate my body. And it was really after my percussion teacher early on said, Evelyn, what would happen? You know, he struck a drum and he just waited, and he noticed the drum really resonated. And he said, well, do we resonate? You know, does the sound kind of come through our body? And so he asked me to take my hearing aids off. And sure enough, you know, I placed my hands on the wall, and you could definitely get the impact of the sound very clearly. However, the resonance of the sound, you really had to pay attention to. And you really had to pay attention to that through a very small part of the body. And it wasn't always the case where every time you played a C or a B flat or an F or something, you'd feel it in the same part of your body. It depended where you were in the room, you know, or which instrument was being played. But nevertheless, the resonance was something that you really had to pay attention to physically. And that's one of the reasons why I began not to wear the hearing aids, because although I heard less, I actually heard more through the body. And that was much more in keeping with how I felt, you know, physically as the musician, projecting that sound and understanding that sound. So you could begin to link, not always, and of course this doesn't always happen, but you know, you could begin to link one sound with the other, because you might have still been feeling something and then connect another sound. For the audience, however, they may have stopped hearing that sound. So to them, it could be just a few seconds of silence, and they're waiting for something to happen. But for the performer, the physical presence of just holding that sound can create quite a feeling, you know, quite a magical feeling, and that can really change your interpretation from translating something to interpreting something. So when you see something on the notated page, you will see that's 4 beats or 7 beats or 5 beats or 3 beats or whatever, and you count that regardless of the acoustic. But the acoustic will really affect, you know, the rhythm of that piece that you're playing and the choices that you make according to the resonance that you're absorbing.
You know, ironically, there are some people who are studying sound and hearing, and discovering that haptics, the sense of touch, can augment people's ability to hear. And so in a very dramatic way, I think you're telling us very much the same thing.
Well, I mean, if I may just step in there, because the haptics are really interesting, and they're always developing, and it's fantastic. And I remember wearing a haptic vest, really, and there was this piece of music that was being fed through the vest, and I could not recognize what that piece of music was, and it was just a kind of, you know, mishmash of feeling, really. And so someone asked me, well, what piece is that? And I said, I have absolutely no idea. And what it actually was a recording of myself playing a solo snare drum piece that I have played a trillion times before. Now, what is interesting, though, was that it was a totally different experience feeling through the back area, as opposed to me being the player, where the sound is often coming up to the face, and you're producing that sound, and you have the drum in front of you. It was just coming from a completely different direction. So I think the haptics are really great when it comes to something that is steady. But if we can find a way to get the emotion of the sound through haptics, I think, wow, that would be incredible.
Well, we'll see. These developments continue. You speak a lot about the power of listening. So can you tell us a little bit more about what listening means to you and your mission to teach the world to listen?
Well, basically, you know, when I started playing an instrument, I thought that, well, you become a better percussionist, in my case, you know, or a violinist or a vocalist, whatever. And then I realized that, well, that, you know, will take more than a lifetime. You're always weeding your musical garden, as it were, and discovering new things physically and technically and that kind of thing. And then I thought, well, I really want to be as good a musician as I possibly can. But then that's subjective, you know. So, you know, you might like one interpretation one day, and then you think, oh, actually, that's not that great. I think I'll change that the next day. And you go on and on and on and on. That's why making recordings are such a challenge. It's like this frozen moment in time. And then I thought to myself, well, what am I actually doing? What am I? And I thought, well, I'm a listener. And what does that actually mean? You know, what am I listening to? And why am I listening to that particular thing? You know, why am I spending hours and hours trying to link that phrase with that phrase in a particular way, you know, or trying to create that sentence when, you know, I'm going to play it for an nth of a second, then it's disappeared for the audience. And will the audience really, you know, tell the difference between that little subtle difference and that subtle difference? But actually, it's those tiny, tiny little things that do make a big difference, the whole of what you're trying to do. And so when I started giving, or when I was asked to give masterclasses, you always imagine that, well, you're there in front of a group of young people and they want to know how to do something. And but actually what I found I was doing was simply asking them questions. You know, we'll find 10 different ways of playing this, or, you know, well, you know, what do you think about that interpretation? Or what's the room doing to this instrument? And what about the mallets we're using? And really for them to be just continually asking these questions and peeling the layers of listening curiosity, as it were. And that was fascinating, because then they became my teachers. You know, I was inspired by them and what they were finding out and so on. So it was just this open dialogue, and I enjoy that, and I think it's really necessary as well. But then, of course, once the internet came into play, and of course, you know, people could see lots of different people on YouTube playing their interpretation of a piece of music, the listening then changed, because they could see people play, you know, and hear them play as well, but then not have the bodily experience, that physical experience. So, and I think this has definitely changed the kind of ways that we're really listening, because it is very high end. It's cosmetic sounds that we're really feeding into the upper part of the body. So for me, I think that the whole key message of Teach the World to Listen is really getting to the depth, you know, of the experience of sound, and the experience of listening, which of course is not always related to sound. So as a musician, I'm dealing with sound, but I'm also dealing with the presence of sound. And that does not mean, a sound happening. It could be, this body of silence. It could be the presence of the audience. It could be, just the presence of the acoustics, and so on and so forth. So it's really, I feel that all of our communication is altered, when we think about the depth of listening. So if you're with someone who has dementia and does not have the ability to speak anymore, well, what do? You're no less attentive with that person than you are with someone who has the most expansive language. Your presence and dedication to that person is absolutely 100%, in the same way that if I was in front of a marimba or a drum kit or something like that, or with another person. So at this moment in time, I'm looking at you and you're my favorite person. You're the most important person in my life right now, because that is the person that I'm communicating with.
Two things immediately strike me. One of them is the notion of soundscape as opposed to landscape. And it feels as if you are exploring the moral equivalent of a landscape, except in the sonic environment. And the second thing about dementia in particular, I think we discovered that people remember music and they respond to music, even if they can't express themselves anymore, or if their memories have evaporated, but their musical memory has not. So it's pretty fascinating. Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Dean. Evelyn.
Oh, heavens, that all I was going to say, is yes, both points are really, really fascinating, because it brings into play the whole idea of improvisation and how important improvisation is. Kids do it naturally, babies do it naturally, and to keep that sense of curiosity as we go through life, I think is so important, because it really does connect us with, every object that we have around us. And I mean, when you think of, a box of matchsticks or something, and give that to a musician from Brazil, and the most amazing things that they can do, and how they manipulate that box of matches, or whatever it might be. And it's finding that fascination and curiosity and letting that imagination be free is so important. But I think the interesting point that you mentioned about dementia and music is that what I would love to see is, how can music and the soundscape and the landscape come into the home of that person. So rather than always having the musician go to that person and finding someone who can play, wartime tunes or tunes from that territory or time or whatever it might be, what about thinking of the soundscape that person worked in? Were they a carpenter? Were they a school teacher? Were they a medical person? Were they a politician? Whatever. And what was the soundscape that they were so immersed in? And can that be explored within literally the space that they find themselves in now, so that we're not always dependent on musicians bringing the music? So that's the difference, I think, between music and sound in that respect.
This is very interesting, because if you think about comfort food as an example of something that food that's familiar to you is comforting, sound that's familiar to you is comforting. It's reminiscent. Well, we could go off on that, but I have a couple of other questions that are very relevant to the I Am Remarkable program, and that has to do with imposter syndrome. Can you talk to us about the challenges that you face when you're composing a new piece of music? Do you wonder, am I capable of doing this? Am I really a musician or not? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think in a way, whether you're composing a piece or learning a piece by someone else, or in any kind of situation, there's always that kind of balance, I think, between thinking, well, you've been asked to do this for a particular reason, so you have to have a certain amount of faith in bringing something to the table, as it were. But I think it's very healthy also to have your feet kind of firmly on the ground, and where your mind is really elastic to any kind of possibility. So, you know, when you learn a piece of music, and you know, you spent time with that piece of music, you then go to an orchestra whom you've never met before, you have never met the conductor before, you have never been in that particular hall before, you're playing a world premiere of a piece, and so you don't know anybody there, and you maybe only have 2 or 3 hours to rehearse this piece together.
Wow.
So there's no way that you can basically plant yourself from the practice room to that concert platform, say, this is how I'm playing it, regardless of what everybody else thinks, you know, so you're all going to have to fit in with me. That isn't going to work. So that's a form of listening. It's the chemistry, it's being open, it's being, you know, really watching the kind of musical body language, as it were. It's so important to really, you know, zoom out of the situation, because, you know, very often as musicians, we zoom in to the minutest detail, but in those circumstances, we zoom out. And I think with a piece of music, it depends on the kind of piece, but most of my writing is for media purposes. So I'm basically, you know, looking at something visual. You know, it can be an elephant in Thailand or something. So that is your visual stimulus, and what is the emotion musically that you want to suspend this scene on. And that I find fascinating, but it's always a constant, you know, exploration. It's like, you know, making bread or something. You're always needing, you know, the shape and the kind of texture and so on. That's always going to happen. But yes, there are times where you just think, oh my God, I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to do. But it's quite healthy to, I think, to be in those situations. We're in a profession that's so much about stress release. You know, you give a performance, it is quite stressful. You finish that performance, release, you know, then stress release. Even the practice process, you know, and where you go from practice to rehearsal in your own mind can generate more stress, less stress, whatever. And that's healthy, I think, in moderation, and likewise in creativity.
Why do I think of that expression where, why do you hit yourself on the head with a hammer? The answer is because it feels so good when you stop. That's the stress and release part. You know, you've done extraordinarily well in your career. Others are hopeful of achieving a significant contributions if they're embarking on greatness, but whatever it is, whether it's music or something else. But if they feel kind of shy or intimidated, if that's what this imposter syndrome is about, what advice would you give someone to sort of overcome those feelings of inadequacy?
You know, I think part of the listening aspect is the inner chat that we have with ourselves, but also it's about the people that we're surrounded by, and what is going on there, and how we interact with that, with the vocabulary that is used, with the chat that is used, the discussions. You know, what is that support system? And we know that, you know, none of our journeys happen in isolation. You know, that is just that, and so. But it's very easy how that journey can suddenly go in a different direction because of something we felt or something that we've latched onto that may have been said, and we are affected by that. And I find in my own situation, reflection is absolutely key. I've always had the need to just have time myself, have time to be with something myself, and just have time to let something, you know, just follow its own course. You know, it's very difficult to describe something like this. But you know, we all move in different ways. We all learn something in different ways at different speeds and so on. You know, if someone said to me, right, play a new piece of music and we need it ready for next week, I'm sorry, but I'm not the right person for that. So I would simply step away. But there are other people who could do that. And but that is knowing yourself and knowing when you can push yourself, when you just need to come back. And I remember very early on in my career, when I was about 19, 20, and a major record company had offered me a contract. And I simply wasn't ready. Now, it wasn't other people who was saying that to me. It was me saying that to me. And I just said, I'm not ready for this. And that was one of the best decisions I'd made. And then a few years later, another record company offered me a contract, and I felt I was more ready. So, you know, it's really taking control of your own situation as far as you possibly can.
So, you know, you really have achieved a lot of things. They are remarkable. So how do you celebrate? I mean, do you have some sort of tradition or habit, like you finished a piece or you finished a performance? I mean, do you have some ritual that you go through to sort of celebrate either the completion of a new piece or the completion of a performance?
Not really, no. No, I think there's a sense of relief for sure,
Yes.
without a doubt. But yeah, you know, it's one of those things whereby you accept the situation and that, yes, you've given the premiere of that piece and so on, but you know then that the real learning curve happens thereafter. So you want to have more performances of that piece. You want to be sure that more players are playing that piece. You want to be sure that there's a recording of that piece and so on and so forth. So your priority quickly goes to, you know, making sure that piece of music has a life of its own, and that it's not just dependent on you, you know, turning up somewhere and playing that piece. So all of the things that I do really have to stand up on their own and not be dependent on one person in particular. So I think naturally I'm not a massively celebratory person. I'm an appreciative person for sure. And I think, yeah, well done, you know, great. But I don't really, you know, go out of my way to yeah. And even if you know, recognition comes your way and so on, it's very nice to happen, but it's a real moment to reflect. It absolutely is. And then it just G's you up to get going with the next step.
So I was just thinking, so you don't have a ritual where you open up a bottle of Glenfiddich and knock down a little.
Well, I need to visit your wine cellar for sure, and then my yeah, I may think completely differently after that.
Oh, you would be more than welcome to explore my winescape, as it were. So at this stage of the game, after all the recognition that you've gotten, do you have a sense of what's the greatest achievement so far? Is there such a thing for you?
Well, it's a very interesting question, really, because you know, I think you get how can I put this? You get a greater perspective of the journey the older you become. And I love being the age I am, because you can look back, but you're also in the present, but you can still look to the future as well. And so you almost have this sort of 380 degree kind of scene of how things lie. And I just really believe that keep listening to yourself. You know, it's what is feeling right at this point in time, and not trying to you know, fit something that felt really right 20 years ago to this situation. Not be you know, dictated by fads or oh, you know, this is all the rage now or whatever. You just keep listening to what this body is saying, and what, you know, what that inner chatter. It's just incredibly important. And so yes, I mean, there are just so many things that I feel I'd like to do. And I think there's one thing is sure, it is the reality that the body will not always be physically able to manipulate the instruments.
Yes.
So if I have the good fortune of living long enough, that is, and you know, so that is something that you do think about, and I think about that obviously a lot as time goes on, and you have to be really realistic about that and own that thought, you know, not be frightened by it, not be fazed by it, not be surprised by it. It's just going to happen. So, but that doesn't stop you from being a musician. So there are still so many things that you can do as a musician that is not dependent on you physically picking the sticks up or doing whatever. So I think that gives you great comfort in a way and keeps that sense of curiosity going, because you know that you can always be part of this profession doing something that makes a difference.
So that's good to know that music is not just performance. There's more to it than that. And that's what I take away from what you just said. You know, you have this great quote. It says, if you want to know about deafness, you should interview an audiologist. My specialty is music. So my question for you is, what's your advice for people with disabilities to gain inner confidence and be able to establish their own personal and professional successes? How do they build confidence? How did you build confidence?
Yes, I think my confidence was built with the great support I had, in that, you know, I wasn't tagged or categorized in any kind of way. I went to a normal comprehensive school, and that was really important. But it was a school that had other hearing impaired kids, it had sight impaired kids, it had kids in wheelchairs and all sorts of things. So, you know, we were just all mixed up together. And that's why inclusiveness has always been really important to me. So people assume, for example, that I work a lot with deaf kids. Actually, I haven't worked that much with deaf kids, but I have worked a lot with kids, you know, in all shapes and sizes, and you know, and I think the learning curve is then absolutely fascinating. It really is. And you can have shared languages, but you can also extend, you know, that vocabulary depending on people's situations. And that to me, I think, is really important. Of course, that's what music is about. You know, you find music everywhere. And so the spoken word can be a barrier, but yet, you know, as soon as you connect a sound with someone through that instrument or through the voice or through a physical expression, that's the connecting point, really. So I think that the confidence for me is always thinking, where's the entry point, and not always going for the obvious one or the one that's been boxed up and you know, you haul out every single time, and that's what the media might want and so on. But basically, where is that entry point? And we all might have a different entry point, but it doesn't exclude anybody from participation or believing.
This makes me think of the I Am Remarkable workshops, because people get exposed to others and they learn from each other, and they discover, you know, what they're capable of expressing, what they're willing and comfortable sharing. They even learn to advocate for themselves. And so much of what I think you've been able to do is precisely that. And it hasn't even been advocating in the vocal sense of the word, but rather advocating by demonstrating your own capacity, your own creativity.
I think that's so important. It's because words can be misinterpreted. Of course they can. And then when we're trying to put those words into a social media platform, you know, where we have to box them up, you know, to a certain amount of characters and so on, becomes yet there's another type of tone there, etc., etc. But you're absolutely right. It's this presence of people, you know, being in the same room, and it is just demonstrating what you're passionate about. And I mean, one of the projects that if I may, that I've been involved with for a few years, and it was created with a historian, a composer, and myself, and it's called The Sounds of Science, and we're rolling this out to some of the schools in the UK. But basically, when we think of history, we don't necessarily think about the oral aspect of history. So we think about going to a museum or a library, or we read a book, or someone talks to us about history. But when we think about the the oral journey of history, that is something that is quite different. And so we created this piece of music called Sounds of Science. And so we look back at 10,000 years worth of man-developed sounds. So obviously we can't include all the sounds, but we chose about 90-something sounds. And, it starts with stone tool making. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking about stone and the material that is and what it feels like in your hand, and imagining trying to create something from that material, and then the fact that you can scrape that and it generates a spark, and then the discovery of fire, and the sound of fire, and then what does that mean? We can cook food on it, we can keep warm with that. So how does that change the body and our relationship? And it goes on and on and on to the exploration of helium, or the steamboat, or the first message down the telephone line, or the sound of the first computer, or silent movies, or the bicycle bell, whatever it might be, the typewriter, I don't know, I mean, all sorts of things. But for, there's a great kind of entry point for people in that project. So they don't have to be musicians. They don't, have to be historians. They don't have to be composers. But, you're really tapping into all different subjects there on a global sense, so you're looking at the timeline of something. So what was happening in the Far East, when the steamboat, was invented, or when... I don't know, when I'm trying to think when Dolly the sheep, was discovered, or whatever it might be. But, what else was going on in the world there? And that can have I think, a huge impact on our understanding of where we are, why we're here, really.
This would be fascinating to imagine. Let's say at 100-year intervals, what would the world have sounded like? What would be the normal ambient sounds that you would hear in the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1700s? Well, we could go on to that for a while, but we're going to run out of time. There's another question I'd like to ask you. Individuals and organizations all over the world are celebrating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, literally right now this week. Is there anything that you would ask or encourage our audience to do to support the persons with disability community, the PWD community, today and every day?
Absolutely. Well, we're in a way isolating a demographic, and what is a disability? Is it something we see, or is it something that someone talks about? In a way, we all have something that we need to attend to, and I think that very often in the age that we're living, the disability is in communication, and I think that communication is absolutely key. So, however we think of disability as such, communication is the thing that is inherent. It's just like this thread that runs through one person, the next person, the next person, the next third person. And then we have this wonderful, blanket, of color and of texture and warmth and connectivity and all sorts of things like that. That's important. And that brings down the barriers of what we think disability is, and that's not trying to minimize anything, but it opens up the conversation, so very often if we see someone in a wheelchair, probably the inner thought that happens is, oh, should we sort of go down to the level, physically the level of that person so that the faces are on the same level? So should we find a seat, or should we crouch down? Or is that going to be bad manners? Or should we bend down? Or what should we do? So these questions. But by asking the question, oh, would you prefer if I sit down? It just opens things up. It's really trying to find the respectful but yet direct communication in order to make it just normal, make situations as normal as possible.
Well, you actually, I think the most important thing you can do is to ask that question, how can I be more helpful? How can I communicate better? My wife's favorite quote comes from E.M. Forster, only connect. Speaking of connecting. Speaking of connecting, though, what's next for you, Evelyn? You've got projects on the way that you can share with us?
Well, I love your wife's quote, "Only connect." I'll remember that one. Well, in a way, the "only connect" actually is a wonderful transition for me, just to mention the Evelyn Glennie Foundation, which is currently in the registration process. But this will basically be a foundation that will have listening at its as the core throughout all of its activities, and thinking how listening impacts all of our lives, from that inner chatter to how we connect with each other, and how we can really support each other, and how our surroundings, affect our way of listening and our productivity in a way. So, when we go into a noisy restaurant, for example, does that affect how we enjoy the food? As opposed to, when we think of, for example, some of the architecture that is built, having curved sort of corners as opposed to angular ones, which are much more helpful for deaf people, for example, that we're not spooked suddenly when somebody jumps out from a corner. But all of these things, are thinking about school canteens, where long ago it was metal, and the scraping of chairs and cutlery and the frequency of the kids' voices, and all of this was up. And really, it's just thinking about that. And, when we build houses, for example, we think about the look of them, the location of them, the materials that are used. But do we think about the actual acoustics of the home that we live in? And what kind of spring clean can we have in our home? Are there sounds there that are just, we don't need? Are they harmful? Have they affected us, but we haven't really been aware of it? But I don't know, how many TVs do we have? How many computers are on? How many phones are there around the house, and so on? And all of this is about listening, and certainly as a musician, I listen to the body, because this is what I have. This is all I have in order to manipulate the instrument. So I can't put someone who's 6'2" into my situation. This is what I have. And that is all about listening.
I would say that listening to your body, as opposed to letting your body listen for you, is also important. Especially the older I get, the more I listen to my body. Well, we have audience questions, Evelyn, so I thought maybe we should get to those. Let's find out what they are. Here's the first one that's popped up. How has advocating for yourself supported your well-being?
That's a really interesting question, because, I'm in a funny kind of business, because, you're in a way promoting yourself in what you do. And I don't always feel very comfortable about that. Usually, I let other people do that. And that's the way it is. Some other people are very good at that and feel much more comfortable without it being boastful or anything. But I do find that difficult. But it's taken me a long time to talk about my hearing situation, for example, because early on, I wanted people to know me as a musician, simply as a musician, and that is that. And I worked hard to be a musician. But to tag deaf musician, I didn't feel comfortable about that. And of course, the media wanted, a sentence, just, oh, how do you do it? And so on. But I just really said, no more. I just don't want that. And then as I began to give masterclasses and so on, and really thought about listening and listening to my own journey, I then became a little more comfortable talking about, well, what is hearing, and what is listening, and what is my situation. So bit by bit, it's come about, but it hasn't been, it hasn't been straightforward. I will say, but again, that's listening,
This makes me think of Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock in Star Trek. I had the pleasure of working with him at one point, and he wrote a book that was called "I Am Not Spock," and he was trying to, not be typecast. And then a few years later, he wrote another book that said "I Am Spock." And this question of who are we, and what do we, how do we want to represent ourselves, and how do we want to think about ourselves is very important.
It is important. And this is where, again, listening, your inner listening is so crucial, because it's like a flowing river. It will always change. It really is. And it just does. And I can't stress how important it is to connect with yourself and just really think, what is happening now? What feels right now? Feel how far you can push and just see where that goes. Because yes, I'm finding, for example, with social media, I've really got to manage this in a way that feels completely right, or as right as possible to the situation I'm in. But it's so easy to let it run away, and
Yes.
and you lose your voice. You just lose your voice, and it gets all tangled up in this machine.
Yeah.
So yes, and that's all about listening, and just stepping back a little and giving yourself that space.
Well, let's see whether the audience has other questions. Here's one. I have taken up drumming lessons later in life, and I love it. Do you have any tips on how to practice at home without a drum kit?
Absolutely. Well, anything can be a drum kit in a way. So it's down to your imagination. There's a fantastic drummer that has been featured on social media, whereby she, started striking her sofa cushions and all just sorts of things just around her, and put a cushion there, and so on, just like a drum kit. And she, talking about imagination, I mean, this is just the perfect example. And she just plays her heart out. And this is about feeling. It isn't about the fact that, well, it doesn't sound anything like a drum kit, or that's ridiculous playing your sofa. But the feel and the belief that she has is absolutely mesmerizing. And she's caught the attention of drummers from around the world who have presented her with actual drums, because she is so interesting. So she has let her imagination go. So really, sometimes less is more. So you can even just have a snare drum, put a towel over it, and just imagine that being your drum kit. So that head, you can have the snare drum there, the hi-hat there, a tom-tom there, and a floor tom there or something, and maybe a ride cymbal there, but you're still dealing with this one head. So let that imagination go. Just as my first teacher said, here's a drum for a week, no stands, no sticks, off you go.
I can just imagine auditioning somewhere and they say, so what instrument do you play? Says, well, I play the sofa and the paper comb kazoo.
Exactly. And look at all the money I've saved.
Right. Yes, exactly. Oh, all right. Let's see if we have a bit more time here. How did you manage to get thousands of drummers synchronized on the Olympics opening ceremony in London? I'm still impressed and listen to Pandemonium regularly till today because it has so much power.
Well, obviously, there were many, many people involved in that, and extraordinary technical people. I mean, if we could give gold medals to anybody in that ceremony, many of them would have gone to the technical people who worked so incredibly hard. Basically, to cut a very long kind of story short, there were different groups of people throughout the UK who auditioned, and basically the audition was enthusiasm. Yes, I'll do it. I want to do it, and be part of the 1,000 drummers. Each of the groups of people were led by maybe more experienced percussion students or drummers or professional percussionists, drummers, and so on, and to work on the rhythm that we all needed to get together. And then eventually we came together for the various dress rehearsals that we had. We recorded the drumming part, or I recorded the drumming part at Abbey Road Studios, and of course the engineers could make that sound like many, many drummers,
Yes, okay.
well. And so there are all sorts of things at play there. But visually, you know, what we saw at that ceremony were indeed 1,000 drummers, you know, all synchronized with their earpieces and being given instructions as to when to play. I had a monitor down by my drum so that you could see, you know, the beat. And if a pattern had to be repeated 4 extra times because something else in the arena was taking time to be sorted out, you would get that instruction. Wow. So it was a huge team effort for sure.
That's fascinating. I imagine Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who was a participant in the Olympics opening, must have been astonished at all of that. Well, let's see if there are any other questions. We have a little bit more time. Here's one, the first of 2 pieces, apparently. Hi, Evelyn. I studied music at the University of Cambridge. I wrote a paper on you, which explored whether deaf people hear silence. So far as hearing people perceive silence in a way that hearing people can't fully comprehend. Curious to hear your thoughts and experience on this. So do you hear silence? And if you do, what is that like?
Yes, that's a really, really interesting question. Yes, I'm very aware of silence, but silence in my mind doesn't really exist as such. So, you know, we can sometimes imagine peacefulness as being silence. So it's just a different environment that we sometimes think is silence. But silence really, I think that whilst there is things happening in your body, you know, veins running or the pulse or the beating of the heart or that inner chatter, silence is extremely difficult to get away from. And just your mood, you know, just that feeling. So for example, if I'm feeling a little bit nervous before a performance and I'm sitting in my dressing room that may be silent, you know, that nervous feeling is creating an awful lot of din, you know, it's creating a lot of noise because of the feel, and it goes back to that feel again. So what do we feel silence to be? You know, what is that feeling? And the only way I can describe silence is if we're dead, you know, is silence death in a way, you know. So I don't know. It's a fascinating question. And of course, this is what John Cage, with his 4 minutes, 33 seconds, you know, was all about. He believed that there was something, such a thing as silence, and to discover that it didn't really exist at all. And when you play that piece where there's no sound coming from the performer on stage, you know, 3 movements of no sound, but the audience, of course, the presence of the audience is creating a fascinating scenario. And sometimes when I perform that piece, I split the 3 movements up so that one movement can be whereby you're listening to yourself. The next movement can be you're listening to the space that you're in. And the final movement could be you're listening to the presence of other people. And when you talk to people afterwards, it's fascinating what they determine to be the loudest movement or the least loud movement, but none of them say there was a silent movement, you know, and that's really quite fascinating.
It really is. Well, pauses can be dramatic, and in art, in visual art, space and white can often be very important parts of an image, as well as something in color. Well, let's see.
And you always have that peripheral, yeah, or not always, of course, but often you have that peripheral, you know, vision, that just something extra. So we are not in this sea of white, you know, where that is the only thing we're experiencing. So we're experiencing the ground that we stand on, you know, the wooden floor or the stone or the whatever. So all of these other senses come into play, and it's the same with sound.
Well, we have time for one last question, Evelyn, and it's the one we ask everyone on this show. What is it that makes you remarkable?
Oh, goodness. That's a tough question. What makes me remarkable is that I enjoy connecting with my own feelings. I enjoy chatting with myself. It sounds very selfish in a way as well, but I enjoy that conversation and giving it time to resonate. in a way. And I enjoy the curiosity of sort of peeling the next layer of listening and where that might lead. And with that, you need obviously yourself, but you need people as well. And I hope that as we're reaching out to all the different planets and the explorations that you all know too well about, you know, that listening is far more than what is just fed through the ears.
Well, I'm sure that everyone has enjoyed listening to what you have to say, Evelyn. So thank you so much for your time and for being part of the I Am Remarkable story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.